in the brochures, the man's name is Kevin Knapp, and he's going to be doing on the balloon corps. He will not be here, but he sent somebody in his place. It'll be the same program, but just a different speaker. So anyhow, I'd like to introduce Bob. Some of you know Bob because you've been on his field trips with him, with the caravan trips. But Bob and I grew up in the same neighborhood as kids. So I've known Bob, I don't know how old you are, but I'm 75.
I'll be 70 next week.
Okay, well,
140 years old.
but through it, I always put him on the spot because I always tell him, hey, I want you to do a program on this, and he's never done it before. So he goes, how many have you've done about 3 or 4 that I've asked you to do that you've never done before.
Between you and Jack Thomas, this is the 9th time I'm speaking.
You are an old timer. But anyhow,
One your president.
But Bob retired 30-something years as a teacher. 33. And how many years as a park guide?
28 years.
20th year as a park guide at Gettysburg and so forth. So without a moment's delay, I'd like to introduce Bob Etchberger. Let's give him a nice warm welcome.
All righty. As you can see, and you've been looking at this for a number of minutes now, farms and females at Gettysburg. The topic tonight is Roger Felby's fault. Roger's sitting over there because a few years ago, when we were going to do one of the car caravan tours, Roger said, "Can you do something with farms?" Sure. And then somebody else suggested, it might have been one of those 2 young ladies over there, that they would like something about females thrown in on one of the tours. So Roger says, "Can you do both in the same tour?" Sure. Okay. And then for whatever this guy's reason was, Tom said, "That farms and female caravan tour that you did on the battlefield at Gettysburg, can you make a PowerPoint presentation out of that?" Sure. But there's one problem. The caravan tour took about 3.5 hours. Check your watches, this is going to be a long talk. So the problem was to reduce a 3.5-hour tour in the battlefield to fit this meeting. Obviously, I'm not going to say a lot of what I said on that battlefield tour. So what I'd like this tour to be is this presentation, kind of an introduction maybe for a lot of you to these 2 topics, farms and females. There is kind of a little flip chart that I'm holding here in my hands. It's produced by the Gettysburg Foundation. It's called the Farmstead Guide of Gettysburg. This contains 47 different farms that are on the battlefield. So obviously, we're not doing all 47. We're skipping a whole lot of them. Here is a book entitled Women of Gettysburg, 1863. This book profiles 41 different women who were there at the time of the battle. Obviously, we're not doing most of them either. So I hope what you're going to see in this presentation tonight will pique your interest enough that you can do your own reading and maybe even your own battlefield tramping. A couple of other books that would be excellent, and you can look at these up here when we're finished. Farms at Gettysburg, The Fields of Battle by Tim Smith. A marvelous book by William Frasinito, Early Photography at Gettysburg. Mr. Frasinito takes period photographs and matches them up with photographs of that spot as it looks today. And then he tells you all about it. Most of the farms are covered in this book. Mr. Frasinito also put out 2 smaller companion books. Do the same thing. period photograph matched with a modern photograph, and a number of the farms are in these two books also. And then what I think is one of the greatest reads about the battle is Philip Lano's Gettysburg Campaign Atlas. Every page in this book has maps. And below the maps at the bottom of the page, of course, is reading material so that you can interpret what is on the maps. Basically, every map in here, you're in farm territory. So you can get a good feel for the farms also by looking at these books. And one other item that is great fun to look at, it is a watercolor reproduction of the battlefield of Gettysburg, and it has probably, now some people do complain about the accuracy, but I figure, well, you're trying to paint what farms look like in 1863. What the artist has done here is painted in, to the best of his knowledge, the crops that were growing in the various fields on the various farms around the Gettysburg battlefield. This is a marvelous little tool to just spend some time with and learning about the farms. So anyway, that's our introduction. So let's get started. Analyzing battlefield landscapes, farms of multiple landscapes, topography. Farms take up all kinds of land. They have all kinds of buildings on them. The land and the buildings of the farm impacted the battle significantly. We're going to take a look using this formula. Now, I don't know if any of you individuals who are military veterans are familiar with this, COCOA. As it says here, instructional methods used by modern military armies to analyze topography and impact on the battlefield. Well, what do those letters stand for? Key terrain. Obstacles. Cover and concealment. Observation. Avenues of approach. And you get COCOA. Every one of the farms on the Gettysburg battlefield has any or all of these. Key terrain. Areas to give an advantage to whichever combatant seizes, retains, and controls. At Gettysburg, the high ground. The Unions. Basically 3-mile-long fishhook battle line anchored on the high ground. One of the two main reasons why the Union won the battle at Gettysburg. They held all of those high ground positions. One Confederate officer will say, on July the 1st, we knocked them onto a high ground position, or we drove them onto a high ground position, and on July 2nd and 3rd, we couldn't knock them off of it. Not for lack of trying, but on July 2nd and 3rd, those attacking Confederate assault troops could not get the Union Army off of those key terrain features. Such as, there's a photograph of Little Round Top. Another photograph of Little Round Top. A key terrain feature. Obstacles. Any natural or man-made feature that prevents, delays, or diverts the movement of troops before or during combat. At Gettysburg, let's go back to that high ground again. But fences are a major example. Farms. Farmers have fences. On the battlefield at Gettysburg, we have basically 5 different types of fences. We have stone walls, we have picket fences, we have post and rail fences, we have worm fences, and we have cow-high, hog-tight fences. Cow-high, hog-tight fences are a combination of fencing where at the bottom you have a stone wall. Over the top of the stone wall is a wooden rider fence. The stone wall keeps the hogs from running out of the field, and the wooden rider fence is high enough that a cow can't jump over it. So you've got cow-high, hog-tight fencing. And you can put both those animals in the same field if you so desire. How how did fences affect either the Union on the defense or the Confederates on the offense? Okay. Little Round Top. We'll get to the fences in a moment, but let's jump back to Little Round Top. Is that an obstacle? Sure is, if you're a Confederate from Texas or Alabama who's been tasked with charging up that thing. And here we're looking down. Confederates would be attacking up through this area called the slaughter pen, and would be attacking through this area and out this direction off the picture, coming over the slopes of Big Round Top. Okay, now let's get to the fencing. So you're supposed to be attacking across the field, and you see stuff like this sitting there. What are you going to do? Well, if you got skirmishers out in front of you, maybe one of the jobs of the skirmishers is to knock down that fencing, take down parts of it so battle lines coming behind can get by, but still, fencing like that, it's an obstacle. You're going to have to go over it, or you're going to have to go around it. Take a look at that close up. Wow, I'd hate to be a skirmisher and be told, maybe basically while I'm under fire, that I've got to knock that stuff down so the guys coming up behind me could get through that. But if we look at this, sometimes you did knock it down. This is on Seminary Ridge, out in front of the Lutheran Theological Seminary. So the fencing back here is an obstacle. Well, this fencing might be an obstacle too, because why is this knocked down? This fencing is knocked down here on purpose to show what soldiers might have done to create cover, to crouch behind. This fencing is knocked down along the approximate side of the Union battle line on Seminary Ridge, looking west on July the 1st. You would have had Union soldiers crouching in behind fencing like this, and they'll eventually lose the fight. A lot of good North Carolina soldiers right in front of this fencing are going to become casualties. Charging at this particular piece of fencing, and it extended in much greater distances in 1863, would have been a 1,400-man unit of North Carolinians. By the time they got halfway across the field they were charging across, they were reduced from 1,400 to somewhere between 600 and 800. They lost basically half their men coming halfway across the field. And some of the Union guys who were shooting them down were crouched down behind fencing that had been taken from this to this. Fencing. This is the biggest charge field. Pickett's attacking, and George Pickett only commanded less than half of the men who were in Pickett's charge. But the men who were in Pickett's charge didn't have just a simple field to head across. As they're heading across that field, they're dealing with what the farmers of Gettysburg had built in that field. Fencing. And when they finally got to the last fencing in their charge along the Emmitsburg Road, they had to climb fencing within 150 to 250 yards of the Union battle line. A great obstacle. And buildings all over the place. Here's a big obstacle for Confederates in the afternoon of July the 1st. Although they won the fight for it, they're going to have to go around this building. You can't go right through it. So when you reach buildings like this, how do they impact the way you're charging or the way you're defending? Cover and concealment. Cover protects from enemy fire. Concealment protects from enemy observation. Gettysburg. Once again, all kinds of things that could pop up that soldiers would use for cover and concealment. All right, here we have a section, a close-up of a section of Little Round Top. Here are plenty of rocks. Confederates charging up Little Round Top. In this particular area, it would have been Texans. Well, look how great those rocks might have been for concealment or cover. But let's flip it back to something. Most of these areas take in more than one letter in cocoa. If these rocks are nice cover for Confederates charging the Union positions on the top of Little Round Top? Might they also be great obstacles that would impede their charge up the same hill? So those rocks are both cover, but they're also an obstacle. Just depends on how you're looking at it. Rocks in the area called the slaughter pen. You're supposed to charge through that area. Well, once again, could be good cover for you, but it could also be a great obstacle. Some of them are not natural. Some of them are man-made, like the stone wall here on Seminary Ridge. But here you can see an example of both natural and man-made cover and concealment. The soldiers that are behind that wall, the soldiers that are in those woods, those two items might be concealing them. But once they're spotted by the attacking forces, then it changes from concealment to hopefully now it can be some cover that will protect you from some of the incoming fire. Here's the 17th Maine Monument. I added this picture simply because if you look at the top of the monument, the soldier is crouched behind a stone wall, and there it is. That's the same stone wall. This is the 1863 stone wall. I'm sure over the 156 years there's been some repairs to it, but still basically. And here you have the same thing. Cover, concealment, obstacle of the stone wall and the woods that are around it. Observation. What can be seen from a given feature? In Gettysburg, we throw in high ground areas. We also can throw in buildings too. Once again, look at Little Round Top. Right now, I'm a Confederate soldier standing on the southern end of Houck's Ridge on top of Devil's Den. I'm using that high ground position to observe what Union soldiers might be over here at that particular time on Little Round Top. But if I cross that little valley and get myself up on Little Round Top, I'm even higher, and now I'm a Union soldier with an even better view of the battlefield. Little Round Top is a great place for observation. The gentleman standing right here, General Gouverneur Kimball Warren, was the chief engineer of the Union Army. Late on the afternoon of July the 2nd, he came up here on the Little Round Top. He was horrified that combat troops had been moved off of that area, out of that area by Daniel Sickles' forward movement. And basically what he found up here on the hill was nothing more than signalmen. But with the help of those signalmen, and he didn't do it alone, I'll repeat that again, with the help of those signalmen, Warren was able to use Little Round Top as an observation post to spot the Confederate attack coming from out here in the distance. And he was able to call for reinforcements that will eventually help to save the Little Round Top position. And then once again, buildings can be used for observation. In the cupola on top of the Lutheran Theological Seminary building, we know that on July the 1st, Union Cavalry Commander John Buford was using that cupola for observation. And we're pretty certain that a Confederate general named Robert E. Lee was probably up in that cupola after the Confederates took over this position. Avenues of approach: operational and tactical movement of troops over natural and man-made features. Gettysburg once again. Okay, you have the road network. All roads lead to Gettysburg. You have the 10 major roads that are bringing the two armies into Gettysburg. The Army of the North is coming in on the roads from the south, and the Army of the South is coming in on the roads from the north. Yes, it is flipped like that, because the Confederates were beyond Gettysburg to the west and to the north. But you have the major road network. Besides that, once the two armies got to Gettysburg using the major road network, how'd they get around the battlefield? Well, you had a ton of farm lanes like this one that they could have utilized to get to different areas of the battlefield. But sometimes an avenue of approach isn't on a road. Sometimes it's just simply across a field. This particular field right here was used by Confederate infantrymen on both the afternoon of July the 2nd and the afternoon of July the 3rd. This is the Cadore farm. This is the Bryan farm. From from the Bryan farm coming down this stretch right here, that's Cemetery Ridge. This portion coming across this section of field up here and in through this section of field here is Pickett's Charge. It's an avenue of approach. I'm not so sure I would have wanted to have used that avenue of approach. Okay, you have some fencing, which might have been cover. And as you're coming across the Pickett's Charge field, it's not a flat field, as it might look like here, but it's a rolling field. And there are swales. So the terrain can give them cover as the Confederates go into the bottom of swales, but as they come up and out of them, they're targets for the Union soldiers then. This was an avenue of approach across open farm fields. Here's another view, and if you orient yourself, there's Pennsylvania State Monument. Right here is Cemetery Ridge. So these open farm fields are avenues of approach for attacking Confederates. But sometimes you get an avenue of approach like this, and we go back to what an obstacle all of this must have been for the attacking Confederates on July the 2nd, coming through this farm territory. And then here also again is another avenue of approach. We're back to the little round top. It's getting even, there's that same picture, it's getting even more difficult. So some avenues of approach are roads, like an avenue of today. But some avenues of approach are over the terrain features, whether it's an open field or up a rocky hill. Your avenue of approach in this situation is where your commanders tell you to attack. Cool. All of these influence the battle in some way. There are dozens of specific examples spread over every specific area of the battlefield. Every farm has some or all of the elements of Cocoa. So the next time you visit Gettysburg or any other Civil War battlefield, think of Cocoa. As you're going through your tour, maybe you can do some of this analyzing in your own mind and trying to figure out how does key terrain or obstacles or cover and concealment or observation or avenues of approach affect the battlefield that you're touring. Farm losses. Every farm on the battlefield, I thought I'd talk just a little bit about this. Every farm on the battlefield suffered some amount of losses, some more severe than others. Losses included buildings, crops, livestock, trees, woodlots, orchards, fences, but they lost everything, depending on who you were. Farmers applied to the government for monetary payment for their losses. None received the amount they claimed. Some received nothing. This is the Black Horse Tavern. At the time of the battle, the Black Horse Tavern was owned by a man named Francis Bream. On our last battlefield car caravan tour, I had the group on Bream's Hill because we were dealing with Longstreet's countermarch. And Bream's Hill is just off the picture out this direction from this tavern. But here's the thing about this. The Black Horse Tavern house is sitting in the middle of a 400-acre farm. There was no combat on this farm. But in this 400-acre farm, during the course of the battle, the following things happened. This irritated some Confederate officers. On July the 2nd, Longstreet's staff officer, Colonel John Black, had the whiskey barrels stored in the tavern destroyed. So your average Confederate infantryman couldn't get in there and have a taste. Supposedly some of the other staff officers were upset that he didn't save some of the whiskey for them. Okay? So, here on this farm, we're losing barrels of whiskey. That's money lost. This will also be the site of Lafayette McLaw's Confederate Division hospital site. There's a Confederate doctor who worked 24 hours non-stop, amputating limbs from the afternoon of July the 2nd to the afternoon of July the 3rd. inside that house. After 24 hours of amputating limbs, he couldn't take it anymore, and he had to stop. He was one of the doctors that Robert E. Lee asked or ordered to remain behind when the Confederate Army retreated, to care for wounded that could not be taken off this farm and put on the wagon train of wounded to take back south because of the severity of their wounds.
Your hair looks beautiful, Dina.
Let's see, how many were there? 70 Confederates were buried here also. So it became a cemetery. The house, all of the buildings on the farm were all damaged. The livestock is gone, the crops are damaged, the whiskey's gone from the tavern. Mr. Breen filed a damage claim with the United States government for $7,000. Anybody want to take a guess what the United States government paid him?
Zero.
You got it. Nothing. You want to know what the United States government excuse was, or at least one of them? The damage done to your property was inflicted by the Confederates. So we're not paying. And we don't think the government functions properly today. Imagine that. Females. So now we get to the other part of the tour. See, this is weird. I've never done a presentation like this. We're bouncing back and forth. But now we have a bit about females. Ah, the females. They keep the home fires burning, raising children, managing farms and businesses, manufacturing jobs, and on and on and on. And then there's this last group. This is pronounced vivandiers. And here maybe is the most famous vivandier in the Battle of Gettysburg, Mary Tempe. A vivandier was a lady who followed the troops. She wore a uniform. As you can see, Mary is wearing a uniform. They helped find food. They helped nurse the wounded. Mary came to Gettysburg with the 114th Pennsylvania, Collis's Zouaves. She led a very interesting life, even to the point of her life ended because she committed suicide. This is long after the war, but she committed suicide. So Mary Tempe is one of the women that is featured in this book, Women of Gettysburg. Two Gettysburg women and their roles and experiences. Elizabeth Thorne, wife, mother, businesswoman, caretaker, cook, guide, military intelligence, refugee, barrier of the dead. Another woman I'd like to talk a little bit about, and this lady you probably have heard of, Mary Virginia Wade, better known as Jenny Wade. Sister, fiance, provider, casualty. This is Elizabeth Thorne's house. It is the cemetery gatehouse. Her house was this. This portion today and this portion today are not historic. This was her house, this arched gateway. Living quarters here, living quarters here. Elizabeth's husband was the caretaker of the Evergreen Cemetery. He joined the Union Army and was off serving as a soldier. He did not fight at Gettysburg. When he left, Elizabeth became what a lot of women became in the Civil War. The person who runs the family business, taking over for the husband who's gone. It's a period of time that proved that women could do this. That they were smart enough to run the businesses that it was thought only men could run. Elizabeth was the caretaker of the cemetery. Okay? Today, she's immortalized right here. There's one plaque that sits in front of her, dedicated to all the women who served in various capacities before, during, and following the Battle of Gettysburg. Their contributions, though rarely noted or honored, were immeasurable. And I put what some of the contributions were on that one previous slide. Here's a little biographical sketch of her. It was her husband Peter who was away, so she ran the cemetery from 1862 to 1865. But here is the important sentence. With the help of her elderly father, amid the heat and stench, Elizabeth buried 91 soldiers in the weeks following the Battle of Gettysburg. And there's her statue. But look closely at her. She's 6 months pregnant. It's a marvelous statue. She's, let's see, did I catch it? Okay. The pick that she would have used to help dig the graves is here. The end of the handle sticking out there, and then she's leaning on her shovel. And here are the 91 graves of Union soldiers that she buried. But besides that, what I had on that little on that previous slide about it, military intelligence, as the Union Army is arriving in Gettysburg, more and more of it coming onto the field late on July the 1st, into the morning of July the 2nd. Elizabeth becomes a cook. She cooks a meal for a number of Union officers. She also becomes a guide. She takes Union officers as they go riding around. They take her with them for her to point out where different features are. So she's taking part in military intelligence. She was eventually told, get out of here. So she left her house. That turns her into a refugee. She's down the road a couple of miles off the battlefield. Then she returns. When she returns, that gatehouse that you saw is trashed. Windows are broken, furniture is broken, linens in the house, clothing in the house, just simply trashed. Blood all over the place because of wounded soldiers that were in there. We see pictures today of areas where people are in situations where where fighting is going on, like modern pictures in the Middle East, in Syria and Iraq, and places like that. The exact same thing you see in those pictures was happening to this lady. And then we go to Jenny Wade. This is a statue of Jenny outside of the house. It is called the Jenny Wade House. As you can see, she's holding a loaf of bread. The house that Jenny is in is not the house she was living in. This is her sister's house, Georgia McClellan's house. A few days prior to the battle, Georgia had given birth. And Jenny and her mother are at the house helping out after the birth of a little boy. When here comes the battle. The house is located on Cemetery Hill, portion of the battlefield that is not preserved. On the one side of Jenny's house is a parking lot. On the other side of Jenny's house is a 3-story hotel. And somehow this gets preserved. Okay? But it's preserved because Jenny died in her sister's house. While she was breaking bread to hand out the back door to Union soldiers. She was in the kitchen, a stray bullet, fired by a Confederate, missed whatever the Confederate was shooting at. Some people have even said they think maybe the Confederate might have been trying to sight in his rifle properly by aiming at the house. Who knows? But the bullet penetrated a closed outside door. It penetrated a closed inside kitchen door and still had enough power that when it hit Jenny in the middle of the back, it went entirely through her body. The bullet was found in her clothing in the front of her after she was shot. These two women, and here's Jenny's grave today in Evergreen Cemetery. The American flag that's flying This is one of the places that is designated by Congress that a flag may fly 24 hours a day, every day of the year. Jenny's sister Georgia moved to Iowa after the war. She joined a women's organization in Iowa. They came back years later, financed the monument that is on Jenny's grave, and that women's organization in Iowa to this day supplies the Evergreen Cemetery with 2 flags. One flag flies from January 1st to June 30th. The second flag flies from July 1st to December 31st. That same women's organization is providing 2 flags a year to fly over Jenny's grave. Both these women exemplify the sacrifices made by all females for the war effort. They were both victims of, and here's a modern term, collateral damage. When armies come into areas and they're doing what armies do, fighting battles, for whatever reason they're fighting the battles on the orders of the government of their country. And here comes the armies over the top of the civilians. And in modern terms, we call the material and the physical damage done to the civilians was collateral damage. Sometimes we shrug our shoulders about it. They just happen to be in the way. Well, here are 2 women that just happened to be in the way at Gettysburg. Now we're going to really start doing the tour a little quickly. One of the places we stopped in this tour was this house. This is Lydia Leicester's farmhouse. Lydia Leicester was a single mom. Her husband was a drunk. He had died a few years before that. Lydia got together money by selling her dead husband's tools and money from a trust that her father had set up for. Her father had set up a trust for her, but she couldn't get the money in that trust until after her husband might be dead, because the father didn't want the drunk husband to get a hold of the money and drink it away. Well, after he died of drunken natural causes, she got the money. She bought the 9-acre farm. This was the farmhouse on it. This house becomes George Gordon Meade's headquarters. Imagine, this is the headquarters for about a 90,000-man army at the Battle of Gettysburg. But inside this little farmhouse took place one of the most important decisions in American military history. Late on the night of July the 2nd, somewhere 11 o'clock or later, General Meade met with his corps commanders and several high-ranking division commanders, and they had a decision to make. Meade is going to make the final decision, but in the conference in this house, he wanted to hear what his generals had to say about, 1, picking up and heading south into Maryland, leaving Gettysburg, and establish a line in Maryland on Pars Ridge along Pipe Creek, and then telling Lee, come on. Another choice was, we stay at Gettysburg and we flip to the offense and we attack Lee. Third choice basically was, we stay at Gettysburg and we stay on the defense and allow Lee to continue to attack us. Which choice do you think they came up with? 1, 2, or 3? 3. They stayed. On the morning of July the 3rd, the combat on Culp's Hill started about 4:30 a.m. until the Confederate attacks petered out. It was 7 hours later, about 11:30 a.m. And in the afternoon was the great bombardment, followed by the infantry assault that we should be entitled Longstreet's Assault, what is called Pickett's Charge. They stayed and played defense, and they stopped the Confederates' offense. That military decision was made in that little house on the night of July the 2nd. When the battle was over, Lydia's collateral damage also. The house took Confederate artillery shots. It's damaged. The barn's damaged. Crops are gone. Livestock is gone. There's 17 dead horses laying around her house. She left them rot away. Okay, bad thing about that was it polluted her drinking water in her well. But the good thing about that was, after they rotted away, she sold the bones. And she got $375 for the horse bones. In today's money, that's $6,000. She made out monetarily from the Battle of Gettysburg. In 1888, she sold this property to the Gettysburg Battlefield Memorial Association for $3,000. In today's money, that's $81,000. Elizabeth was a pretty good businesswoman when she got around to selling things that were on this farm. All right, I mean Lydia. Carrie Sheed's house. One of the cool stories of the battle took place in this house on July the 1st. There is a Union colonel in there, and some people say, you know, this may not be totally 100% accurate the way I'm going to tell the story. But why mess up a good story? This is the way I was told the story when I was younger. I've read it this way in some books. I've read it slightly different in other books. But why mess up a cool story? This is the way I'm going to tell it. Am I telling you the way it is exactly 100%? Probably not, but it's cool. Anyway, there's a Union colonel in this building, and there's a Confederate pointing a gun at him, and he's telling the Union colonel, surrender your sword to me. And the Union colonel has enough guts to say, nope, I'm not going to give up my sword unless the person I'm surrendering it to is equal or higher rank than me, and you're not. The guy's pointing a gun at him. Well, I guess the argument got gone good enough that Carrie decided to step into the situation, and she supposedly told the Confederate soldier he was wanted out the back of the house or somewhere for something. While he was gone, she took the sword of the colonel, she put it up against her leg. Now remember, she's wearing a skirt that goes down to her shoe tops. She folded her skirt around it, and she headed to the basement and hid the sword. This probably isn't the exact dialogue, but it's the cool dialogue that I was taught when I was a kid. When the Confederate comes back and demands a sword again, the colonel said, I already surrendered it to somebody who outranks you. That was kid. He will be taken prisoner, he will escape, make his way back to Gettysburg, come back to Carrie Sheed's house and get his sword back. Carrie ran a girls' school in that house. Private school. This is the widow Thompson's house. The widow Thompson's husband was also a drunk who died before the Civil War took place. She somehow became friends with a politician from Pennsylvania. I believe his name was Thaddeus Stevens. And Thaddeus Stevens held a trust on her house so that she could live there. For a period of time, he was a lawyer, had a law office in Gettysburg before he became a member of the United States Congress. This building and the yard area around it will become Robert E. Lee's headquarters site. McPherson Farm, hospital site. On the morning of July the 1st, the Union owns McPherson Ridge and this farm. On the afternoon of July the 1st, the Confederates own McPherson Ridge and this farm. Hence you get this plaque on the side of it that says this barn was used as a hospital and sheltered the wounded of the Union and Confederate armies, simply because this barn changed sides during the course of July the 1st. Lady named Sarah Broadhead came into this building, the Lutheran Theological Seminary, after the battle to help care for the 700 plus wounded that were in there. There's two neat stories about her. One of them is that maybe as long as a week after the battle, she wondered what was down in the basement. Now, I don't think it was a week. I think it was a little bit shorter. But she wondered what was down in the basement. So she opened the door and headed down the steps. What was down in the basement and laying in water that had come into the basement because of rains that had taken place after the battle were wounded Confederate soldiers who hadn't had any food or care for a couple of days. Because of the curious Mrs. Broadhead, those Confederates were brought upstairs and they were cared for. Now, when the battle's all over, by the Union medical teams. Also, she was quite horrified by something that she got used to it, but a lot of the wounds of the men were infested with maggots. There's flies all over the place. Flies are laying eggs in the wounds. Maggots are hatching out. Now, this sounds totally, I'll use a real technical word, yucky. But it wasn't totally bad because those maggots would feed on infected skin, and that helped to keep the wounds maybe a little bit okay for a little bit. Wasn't the best of medicine, but was helping out a bit. The first time she saw this, she almost couldn't stand that. Her description of walking into a room with a towel and a basin of water to deal with the wounded soldiers and looking at the stumps of amputated limbs and seeing them infested with maggots crawling around was something that she didn't like at first. The Louisiana State Monument, the spirit of the Confederacy, blowing her trumpet to call to her the spirits of dead Confederate soldiers. But she's also Saint Barbara, the patron saint of thunderstorms. How does she become the patron saint of thunderstorms? And at the same time, the patron saint of artillerymen. Back there's a cannon. She lived in Asia Minor, around the present-day country of Turkey, way back. And she was the member of a pagan religion, and she fell in love with a young man who was a Christian. And she went home and she told dear old Dad that she was in love with this Christian man, and she was going to, continue to date him, and they were in love and all of this. And Dad said, you got to break it off. Well, she didn't. She married the guy. And then she goes home to tell dear old Dad that she married this young Christian man. And Dad did not take it well. She thought he'd probably say, oh, that's okay, hugs and kisses, you're all forgiven. Dad didn't take it well. Dad had her arrested. She's charged with disobeying her father, and she's charged with marrying a Christian man, which is against the law for her people. She's put on trial. She's found guilty. Her punishment is death, form of execution, beheading. And she is beheaded. Anybody want to take a guess who the executioner was that chopped off her head? Her dad. On the way home from beheading his daughter, a thunderstorm comes up, and Dad is struck and killed by a bolt of lightning, and hence Barbara became the patron saint of thunderstorms. Now, when you fire a cannon like in the background here, what comes out of a cannon? Thunder and lightning! So Barbara was taken by early artillerymen and morphed into the patron saint of artillerymen. And here she is on the Louisiana State Monument. Bushman Farm. Talk about an avenue of access headed towards an obstacle or an observation point. Confederate troops from Alabama, Georgia, will be heading across all of this terrain headed towards Little Round Top. Possibly some of them are even going to climb like the 15th and 47th Alabama, Big Round Top, heading across the Bushman Farm and across the Slider Farm. But if I back up one, that's troop movements. There's something very significant that might have happened here in this field, or it might have happened down in this area on the other side of the Bushman farmhouse. Union artillery shell bursts in the air. Fragments come raining down. And a Confederate general named John Bell Hood takes a fragment in the arm. He's a division commander. Wonderful, wonderful combat commander. Maybe the best combat division commander in Lee's army. He's out of the battle. And that causes command confusion in the Confederate forces that are fighting at the southern end of the battlefield, attacking areas like Little Round Top, Devil's Den, the Slaughter